It's my distinct pleasure now to have you meet a very special person who's going to be our keynote speaker this year. It's Andrea Wolf. She is an excellent writer. I read her book and it was amazing. She sort of channeled one of the greatest scientists of our time, well, not our time, a previous time. Andrea, why don't you come out here? Perhaps she'll come. Andrea Wolf, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. See you.
Wow. I am so excited to be here. So today you have heard a lot about the future and the possibilities of GIS, but I'm actually going to take you 200 years into the past, and I'm going to talk about a man who's almost forgotten today, but who was the greatest and most famous scientist of his age. And not only that, he was also the founder of what you are doing here today. And I'm pretty sure he would have loved GIS and he would have loved this community. His name was Alexander von Humboldt. Some of you might have heard of him because there are a lot of geographers here. But in general, he's really almost forgotten in the English-speaking world. But his name lingers everywhere. In fact, there are more places, plants, and animals named after Alexander von Humboldt than anyone else in this world. There is, for example, the Humboldt Current, the ocean current that hugs the west coast of South America. There's the Humboldt penguin, the Humboldt California lily, and a giant 5-foot squid called the Humboldt squid, which swims in the Humboldt Current. There are dozens of mountains and parks named after him in Latin America. There are mountain ranges named after him in China, in South Africa, and in New Zealand. In North America alone, there are 13 towns and 4 counties named after him. Even the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt. And I would have loved to say I'm going to Las Vegas Humboldt, but that is not going to happen. So who was this man? Let's start with a few facts. He was born in 1769, the same year as Napoleon. He was the second son of a wealthy aristocratic Prussian family. When his parents died, he was left a very wealthy man, but he left his life of privilege and he spent his entire fortune on a 5-year exploration of Latin America. And it was a journey that shaped his life, that shaped his thinking, and that made him legendary across the world. He was a visionary thinker. He was a famous scientist. He was so famous that his contemporaries said he was the most famous man after Napoleon. They also called him the Shakespeare of the sciences. He influenced some of the most important thinkers, politicians, revolutionaries, poets, and artists. Thomas Jefferson, for example, called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Napoleon was jealous of him. Charles Darwin said that he would have never boarded the Beagle, nor therefore not written The Origin of Species without Humboldt. Henry David Thoreau's Walden would have been a very different book without him. And John Muir's ideas on forest preservation were heavily influenced by Humboldt's ideas. Simón Bolívar, the man who liberated the Spanish colonies in South America, said that his revolution was invigorated by Humboldt's writing. And Germany's most celebrated poet said having spent a few hours with Humboldt was like having lived several years. Even Captain Nemo and Jules Verne's famous 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea owned all of Humboldt's books. He was, as one contemporary said, the greatest man since the deluge. He died in 1859, just before, a few months before his 90th birthday, and 10 years later, on the 14th of September 1869, the centennial of his birth, was celebrated across the world. There were parties everywhere. There were parties in Mexico, in Melbourne, in Moscow, in Buenos Aires, in Egypt, in Berlin. But some of the greatest celebrations were here in North America. There were parties in Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Charleston, Cincinnati, 3-day parties in San Francisco. 25,000 people marched through New York in his honor. Yet today, he's almost forgotten here. So why should we care? I think we should care a lot, otherwise I would have not written my book, The Invention of Nature. And I think there are many reasons. One important reason is that Humboldt invented a concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today. He came up with this idea that nature is a web of life. He described Earth as a living organism where everything was connected, from the tiniest insect to the tallest trees. He brought together the arts and the sciences because he said we needed to use our feelings to understand nature. He also invented isotherms, which we can still see on today's weather maps, and his map revealed this new world of pattern that crossed the globe in wavy belts. And it was very different to how temperature had been presented beforehand. And these are just two examples. One is Thomas Jefferson's weather book from 1776 and 1777. So you can see these are just long lists of tables of temperature. But Humboldt, invented this new way of showing scientific data. He also defined global climate and vegetation zones at a time when other scientists were very much still looking through the narrow lens of classification. He really is the founder of the discipline of plant geography. He was a pioneering map maker, and I think he's the founder of what we call today infographics. I just wanted to show you a couple of examples. So this is a map of plant distribution, and you can see how he's using scientific data graphically. I'm going to show you a detail of this map. So you can see how he uses color coding and icons to show us the different vegetation zones across the globe. Here's another one. It's his map on the subterraneous connections of volcanoes. Again, he's using really complex scientific data so visually, and may I say, so beautifully. He was also the forgotten father of environmentalism because he warned us of the devastating effects caused by deforestation, monoculture, and irrigation. And amazingly, he predicted in 1800 harmful human-induced climate change. All of these ideas and concepts are incredibly important, but what is much more important is that he came up with a worldview, a holistic worldview that still very much shapes our thinking today. So when I went to Esri's headquarters in April this year in Redlands, I was just amazed what I was seeing there. I thought I'd landed in Humboldtian heartland, really. I heard terms such as analysis, observation, measurements, comparison, integration, visualization, holistic, interconnected, sharing information. All of these were incredibly important for Humboldt. And I can't quite get over the fact how many similarities there are between what you do and what he's doing. And I just wanted to give you one little example. It's an example that has to do with diamonds. So by the 1820s, not a single diamond had been found outside the tropics. In 1829, Humboldt went on an expedition to Russia. And he based on geological information he had received from Brazil, where diamonds had been found, he predicted that there would be diamonds in the Ural Mountains in Russia. And everybody thought he's absolutely, utterly mad. In fact, the Russians called him the crazy Prussian Prince Humplot. But sure enough, a few weeks later, Following his instructions, the first diamonds were found in Russia. These were the very first diamonds found outside the tropics. And a few years later, he also predicted diamonds in the Appalachian Mountains. So think about today's spatial analysis, which includes identifying patterns and clusters, and then using that to predict different locations. Think about modeling techniques, which include predicting how objects disperse, interact, and flow. All of this is based on exactly the same principles of what Humboldt was doing more than 200 years ago. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me tell you a little bit about my journey to find Humboldt. So the Invention of Nature is really my attempt to find him, but also to restore him to his rightful place on the pantheon of nature and of the pantheon of nature and science. And the great thing about writing a book about an explorer is that you get to travel to pretty amazing places yourself, all in the name of research, of course. So for me, writing this book was very much a journey through letters and landscapes, and I wanted to kind of show you a few of the things that I discovered. So for example, I read his notes in the archives in Berlin, and what you can see here is that man has the worst handwriting on the planet. I found his passport, his Spanish passport, in an archive in Quito. So this is the passport that the Spanish king gave Humboldt to travel through the Spanish colony with. I read Charles Darwin's copies of Humboldt's books. Actually, these two, which you can see up here, are the books that Charles Darwin took with him on the Beagle around the world, and they're still in an archive in Cambridge today. I went to the Antisana, which is a volcano in Ecuador, and at 13,000 feet, I found this hut. And it's a hut in which Humboldt had spent the night before his final summit of Antisana. And at that very moment, this herd of wild horses suddenly turned up, and 4 condors were circling above my head. So that was a pretty good day of research. I paddled along the Orinoco in the rainforest of Venezuela. But the most exciting day for me was when I climbed Chimborazo, another volcano in Ecuador, and a mountain that was so elemental for Humboldt's vision of nature. And as I walked up the barren mountain slope, my admiration for him grew with every single heavy step I was taking. I only made it to 16,400 feet, but he went even further. So let me take you up Chimborazo. It is the 23rd of June, 1802. Chimborazo is almost 21,000 feet high. It's then believed to be the highest mountain in the world. It's about 100 miles south of Quito. Humboldt and his 3 traveling companions are crawling on hands and knees up a very narrow ridge. And when they look to the left, they see a steep, ice-encrusted cliff, and it doesn't look much better on the right-hand side. There's a sheer 1,000-foot drop. The icy wind has numbed their hands and feet, their eyes are bloodshot, their gums are bleeding, and they're really struggling to breathe in the thin air. They're at about 17,000 feet high. They can hardly see anything because they're just enveloped by this thick fog. But nonetheless, Humboldt stops every few hundred yards, and he takes us his instruments. And he sets them up, and he measures. He measures humidity, he measures gravity, altitude, temperature, the blueness of the sky, and he notes everything meticulously. So they crawl on, and then suddenly the fog lifts, and they can see the snow-capped Chimborazo against the blue sky. But they also see a huge crevasse in front of them. They are at 19,413 feet, which is about 1,000 feet below the peak. And Humboldt realizes that they can't go any further because there's no way to cross this crevasse. And though they can't go any further, they've achieved something really remarkable. No one has ever been this high before. and they hold the world record for several decades. And as he is standing at the top of the world and he's looking down at the mountains below him, Humboldt's vision of nature clarifies and everything falls into place. And he realizes that the journey from Quito up Chimborazo was like a botanical journey from the equator to the poles. He had seen how the vegetation had changed from the tropical species in the valley all the way up to the last bit of lichen just below the snow line. He had seen how the vegetation zones were stacked on top of each other. He also realized that many of the plants he had seen were similar to those he had seen elsewhere in this world. He had seen in the Alps in Switzerland, he had seen in the Pyrenees in Spain, and he'd seen on Tenerife. And he was struck, he said, by this resemblance which we trace in climates most distant from each other. No one had ever looked at plants like this before. So where other scientists, where other botanists were looking at plants through the narrow lens of taxonomic units, Humboldt saw the vegetation, the plant world, as a global force. His brother Wilhelm said that he believed that Alexander's mind was made to connect ideas, to detect chains of things. And that's what we have to remember when we think about Humboldt. It's always about chains of things. And he shows us this with a drawing. This is a huge 2-by-3 foot drawing, which was a folder in the first book he published after his return from Latin America. And every single person in this room had a poster of it on your seats today, this morning when you came in. What you see here is a cross-section of Chimborazo, and all the little black lines you can see on the mountains are the plants drawn onto the mountains according to the altitude, exactly where he had found them. To the left and to the right are 20 columns which provide more information, such as information on gravity, on the chemical components of the air, of humidity, temperature, everything drawn into the columns according to the altitude where he had found it. He calls this his Naturgemälde, which is a pretty untranslatable German term. It means something like a painting of nature, but like so many German compound nouns, it has a philosophical meaning, which also means something like there's a unity there. It is, I think, one of the most incredible visualizations of very, very complex scientific data. I just wanted to show you a detail of it. So you can see the plant names drawn into the mountain, but he also writes into the clouds the height of the city of Quito and also of Mount Vesuvius. And then to the right, you can see some of the columns. So no one had ever presented scientific data so visually. So don't you think this is an early geographical information system? That's where it all started, I think. It's complex, it shows complex information, it reveals intricate relationships, and yet it is so simple and easy to understand. But let me tell you a little bit about his exploration of Latin America. Humboldt and the French botanist Aimé Bonpland left Europe in June 1799, and they spent 5 years in Latin America. And I'm going to have to skip over some really exciting bits here, so you're going to have to read the book for that. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what kind of man he was. He was unbelievably restless. He himself said that he felt as if he was chased by 10,000 pigs. He was obsessed with measurements. He schlepped 42 scientific instruments across Latin America, all of them packed individually in velvet-lined boxes. He carried a huge pendulum clock, for example, thermometers, but also a telescope, a hygrometer, which he used to measure humidity with, and a travel barometer. But he was not just interested in empirical data. He also said that nature must be experienced through feeling and imagination. So he was really driven by this sense of wonder. But he was not a cerebral scholar. He was brazenly adventurous. Take his journey along the Orinoco and the surrounding river networks, for example. He and Bonpland paddled 1,400 miles along the rivers, 75 grueling days deep in the rainforest, and it made for very dangerous traveling. Their boat capsized and they almost drowned, for example. They almost starved to death. They suffered from high fevers. They encountered dangerous animals such as crocodiles, snakes, mosquitoes, and jaguars. But they also encountered the most magnificent ecosystem on our planet, the most magnificent web of life, the rainforest. And Humboldt was interested in everything. He, for example, tasted the water of the different rivers like a wine connoisseur. He was fascinated by animals such as the howler monkey. He was fascinated by plants and actually discovered the Brazil nut and subsequently introduced it to Europe. But he also returned with the most amazing maps. So look at this one here, for example. This is a map of the Orinoco, and I think it's just so beautiful. But I think in order to appreciate it really, it's interesting to have a look at how maps looked before. So this is his map after his return. This is a map of the United States done in 1747, around 50 years before. What you can see here is a very detailed map, but you can see here that the mountains are shown through generic hill profiles. Now look at this. So this is another of Humboldt's maps of the course of the Orinoco. So he's using Hachur technique of shading mountains. This was a very, very new technique at that time. So he comes back with these incredible maps. But he was also interested in the indigenous people. And unlike most Europeans, he did not regard them as savages. Quite the opposite. He said they are the best geographers, the best observers of nature he had ever met. While he's in South America, he also realizes how humankind was destroying nature. And he noted that in particular at Lake Valencia in Venezuela. It was a very wealthy agricultural region, lots of plantations, sugar, tobacco, indigo. But what he saw here was how the forests had been felled to make way for cash crops, how the water levels of the lake were falling because farmers had diverted the water for their fields. Seeing this destruction, he is then the first to explain the fundamental functions of the forest for the ecosystem. He talks about the tree's ability to store water, the tree's ability to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, their protection against soil erosion, and the forest cooling effect. It was here at Lake Valencia that he first talked about harmful human-induced climate change. At the Venezuelan coast, he also noted how unchecked pearl fishing had completely destroyed the oyster stocks. At the high plateau of Mexico City, he noted how the local irrigation system had left the valley below completely barren. And he also noted how mines exploited the land and the indigenous people. He talked about mankind's mischief, which disturbs nature's order. He and Bonpland explored Venezuela and the Orinoco, and then they went up north to Cuba, and then they went back to South America, to what's today the northern coast of Colombia, and then they went all the way down to Lima, 2,500 miles, most of it through the Andes, most of it on foot. On their way, they climbed every reachable volcano. So by the time they reached Chimborazo in June 1802, they were really the most experienced mountaineers in the world. The more difficult it was, the more Humboldt seemed to have enjoyed himself. And I found this wonderful letter which he wrote from South America to a friend in Germany. It's a long, long letter in which he describes in great detail all the dangers he's encountered, how he was almost killed by a jaguar, how he almost drowned. And then he ends this letter with this sentence: "And you, dearest, how is your monotonous life?" So he was also a bit of a show-off. In April 1804, after a year in Mexico, Humboldt decides that it's time to return to Europe. But he adds a little bit of a detour because he wants to meet this man. He wants to meet Thomas Jefferson, who is then the third president of the United States. And the timing of Humboldt's visit was absolutely perfect for Jefferson because he had just acquired the Louisiana Territory in the previous year for the United States. So here was this heroic explorer who just spent a year in Mexico, much of it also in the archives in Mexico City. So Jefferson bombarded Humboldt with questions about their new neighbor, Mexico, and Humboldt very happily opened his notebooks and his maps to brief the President of the United States, including leaving him with 18 tightly written pages that summarized everything he knew about trade, agriculture, and mining in Mexico. He returned to Europe in August 1804, and he lived in Paris and later in Berlin. And he very quickly established himself as the center of scientific inquiry. He worked at a really frantic pace, fueled by his love for knowledge and by many, many, many cups of coffee, which he called concentrated sunshine, which I think is such a beautiful image. He experimented, he gave lectures, he wrote dozens of books. He jumped so quickly from one subject to another that few people could actually follow him. And I wanted to show you a couple of his manuscripts just so you get an idea how his mind worked. For me, it was really almost like an epiphany when I opened the boxes in the Berlin archive seeing these. So these are his lecture notes. So he starts fairly conventional enough. He writes down his ideas in a kind of fairly linear manner, and then he has a few ideas, and he squeezes them in the corner here and in the corner there, and then he runs out of space. So you would think, now he's just going to get another sheet of paper, isn't he? Like, no, not Humboldt. This is what he does. He starts writing his ideas on little bits of paper, and then he sticks them all on top of each other. And so you can see some of them here on the left-hand side, you can fold out. He reads something in a book, he tears out a page and kind of sticks it on there. So you end up with this amazing multi-layered collage of thoughts, which have really no apparent order to anyone else than Humboldt. But I think what it also shows you is that not only did he see nature as a web of life, but that's how his mind worked. His mind was a web. It was not going in a linear manner. He also wrote dozens of books, many of which became huge international bestsellers, but he also returned from South America with hundreds and hundreds of drawings and maps, and he employed 50 map makers and artists to turn his field sketches into the most magnificent engravings and maps. And I just wanted to show you a few. I'm going to run relatively quickly through them, but just to give you an idea. So this is, for example, his sketch of a map of South America, which I found in an archive in Quito. This is a tiny little piece of paper where he draws the profile of the Andes in Chile. This is his field sketches of rock strata in Venezuela, and another sketch of rock strata in South America. So these are his field sketches. This is what it becomes in his publication. So these are rock formations an engraving in one of his books. This is also in one of his books, he calls it Journey Towards Chimborazo. So it's a kind of mixture of the Naturgemälde, but also about rock strata. And then this is just a tiny little detail from his map of Mexico, which I think is absolutely stunning, 1811. And this is my favorite. So this is a tiny, tiny little sketch in a letter. And what you see here is 5 mountains from across the world put next to each other, from the Andes, from the Himalaya, from the Pyrenees, from the Alps, and from Lapland. And he compares their height of snow line. And this is what it becomes in his published work. Isn't that beautiful? So we often draw a sharp line between the arts and the sciences, but Humboldt did not do that at all. And in none of his work, actually, but where we can see this most clearly is really in his pioneering work in map making and infographics. And so I want to show you just a few things, just to explain and show and illustrate to you that he really is the founding father of what you are doing here. So his maps are amazing in terms of topography, as I've shown you, but he also shows things like economic data. So this is his map, also from 1811, the transportation of precious metals across the world. This is the distribution of different human races across the globe. This is actually from an atlas that accompanied one of his books. This is a map of geomagnetism. He was very interested in all these kind of global forces. He was fascinated by volcanoes, tsunamis, and earthquakes. This map, for example, shows volcanoes and earthquakes. The green circles show groups of volcanoes. Green dots show inactive volcanoes. Red dots show active volcanoes. Gray shaded areas show areas of earthquakes. The darker the gray, the stronger the earthquakes. Now, to complete his investigation of global nature, he then goes on another expedition. He goes to an expedition to Russia in 1829. He travels 10,000 miles. He uses 12,244 horses because he changes horses every 20 miles. He does 10,000 miles in less than 6 months, and he is 60 years old, so he's really not calming down with age whatsoever. When he returns from his expedition in Russia, he's finally ready to write the book that would make him famous across the world, and that book was called Cosmos. It was a huge international bestseller. It was a book in which he took his readers on an incredible journey across the universe. It was a journey that took them from Earth to outer space, from the tiniest fleck of moss to the highest peaks of volcanoes, from botany to landscape painting and to poetry. It was a book unlike any other book ever published. So at a time when other scientists were crawling into their ever-narrowing disciplines, Humboldt wrote a book that did exactly the opposite. He wrote a book that brought everything together. It was a portrait of nature pulsating with life. And it was really his declaration of love to nature. And it was the book that made him a household name in America. Now, my book, The Invention of Nature, is not just about Humboldt. It's also about some of the key people he influenced. And we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I kind of chose a couple to give you an idea how influential he was. So let's have a look at Charles Darwin. As a young man, Darwin read Humboldt's book, Personal Narrative, which you can see here on the left. And Personal Narrative was a book that was partly a travel account and partly a scientific treatise of Humboldt's exploration in Latin America. And it was a book that changed everything for Darwin. So let's hear it from Darwin himself. This is what he wrote. My admiration of his famous personal narrative, part of which I almost know by heart, determined me to travel to distant countries and led me to volunteer as naturalist on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. On the Beagle, Charles Darwin kept his copies of Humboldt's books on a shelf next to his hammock. And amazingly, these books are still around. They're in an archive in Cambridge, and when you read them, they make for pretty remarkable reading because Darwin annotated them heavily. So you open the pages and there are hundreds and hundreds of pencil marks. And reading them is like listening to Darwin having a conversation with Alexander von Humboldt, because Humboldt influenced Darwin in so many ways. First of all, his descriptions of Latin America actually made Darwin want to go to South America. Once Darwin was in South America, he saw this new world really through the lens of Humboldt's writing. And this is what Darwin wrote when he first arrived in Brazil. I am at present fit only to read Humboldt. He, like another sun, illuminates everything I behold. Darwin also used Humboldt's books as a model for his own writing. So Humboldt, in his writing, combined evocative landscape descriptions with kind of hard scientific data. So Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle is very similar in style. And while he was working on his theory of evolution, he was also using Humboldt's books to find examples. And Humboldt was later described by a friend as a pre-Darwinian Darwinist. So it was in Humboldt's books that Darwin read about the gradual transformation of species. He underlined when Humboldt wrote that plants and animals limit each other's numbers. All of these were obviously very important for his theory of evolution. And so that you believe me that I am not making this up, I wanted to just show you one page from Darwin's books. So this is Darwin's copy of Humboldt's personal narrative, and the handwriting you see at the top, that's Darwin writing in the margins. This is what he wrote. To show how animals prey on each other, what a positive check. So here you have it, in a nutshell, the concept of natural selection written by Darwin into his copy of Humboldt's book. But even one of the most important pieces of American nature writing, Walden, was influenced by Humboldt. In 1847, Henry David Thoreau left his cabin at Walden Pond, and he would eventually turn his 2 years there into Walden, which he published in 1854, so 7 years later. But he struggled to write Walden. He struggled because he was seeing nature like a scientist. He's observing nature meticulously like a scientist, but he was also admiring nature's beauty, and he did find it impossible to find a balance. So he wrote, he rewrote, he redrafted, he drafted and redrafted, and finally he just put away the manuscript for Walden because he just couldn't work out how to do it. He was so frustrated in the end that he said, what kind of science was this, which enriches the understanding but robs the imagination? And then Thoreau read Humboldt's Cosmos, and he discovered a completely new world. And he took out his manuscript and he rewrote Walden. So the Walden you know today is the Walden Thoreau wrote after reading Humboldt's Cosmos. In Cosmos, Humboldt had written, descriptions of nature may be scientifically correct without being deprived of the vivifying breath of imagination. So Humboldt really allowed Thoreau to weave together science and imagination. And a couple of years later, Thoreau wrote in his journal this sentence, which I think is so beautiful. Nature will be my language full of poetry. Humboldt also strongly influenced, John Muir, the man who we call today the father of the national parks. Muir grew up reading Humboldt's books, and as a young man, he said, how intensely I desire to be a Humboldt. Like Darwin, Humboldt also read Muir also read Humboldt's books, and he read them with a pencil in hand. He underlined them heavily. He even wrote his own indexes. This is Muir's copy of Humboldt's book, Views of Nature. Humboldt was instrumental in Muir's ecological thinking, and Muir underlined everything that Humboldt wrote about, the destruction of forests, but also about the protection of forests. He also thought about Humboldt's concept of plant distribution according to altitude, and he also does it with a drawing, which is much more simple than Humboldt's Naturgemälde, but it's the same principle. So this is a little sketch in a drawing, in a letter that Muir sends to a colleague, and what he shows here is the migration of Arctic plants from the Central Valley in California up the Sierra Nevada to the glaciers over a period of thousands of years. So, like Humboldt, Muir also connects botany, climate, geology, and geography. He's also inspired by Humboldt's vision of nature as an interconnected whole, as this living thing where everything hangs together. And you all heard Jack quote John Muir this morning, and I'm going to do this again because this is one of his favorite quotes. It's one of my favorite quotes. This sentence where Muir says, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." That is from Humboldt. And that's the amazing thing. There's this kind of long, long legacy that goes through all the way to Humboldt. But let me have a final look at Alexander von Humboldt and explain just a little bit why I think he's so important today. His story really explains why we think about nature the way we do it. He's given us our concept of nature as a web of life. And today, as scientists are trying to understand and predict the consequences of global climate change, Humboldt's interdisciplinary methods, but also his concept of nature as a global force remain very, very relevant. But one of his greatest achievements, I think, was to make knowledge accessible. He said that with knowledge comes thought, and with thought comes power. So his belief in the free exchange of information, in uniting scientists, in fostering communication across disciplines, remain an important pillar of science and communities today. And this is exactly what you are doing here. You are sharing all your knowledge, all your data with your web GIS. Humboldt created an incredible network of people who helped him to collect all this information. And that's what you are doing when you're engaging with citizens, students, scientists, co-workers. Everybody collaborates, everybody participates. You have created a living atlas. You have contributed millions of data sets. And it's a living atlas that Humboldt could have only dreamt of. It's accessed several billion times each month. That is knowledge that brings power to people and to communities, just as he always wanted. So to me, it feels as if we've come full circle. In a way, I think he's the most modern of all scientists, the way he worked, the way he thought, the way he understood nature. He had trunks full of scientific instruments. You have your mobile devices, your tablets, your computers. He saw patterns and clusters in his head. You run a geo-processing tool that does mathematically the same as he did. He wrote dozens of books and more than 50,000 letters sharing all his knowledge. And you do the same with WebGIS, with your web maps, with your story maps, with your web scenes. So I'm pretty sure that he would have loved this community. He would have loved the possibilities of GIS, because what you do here is truly Humboldtian. So let me end with a quote. This is what Ralph Waldo Emerson said about Humboldt in 1869 during the centennial celebrations in Boston. He said, "The wonderful Humboldt, with his solid center and expanded wings, marches like an army, gathering all things as he goes." Thank you.
great. You're great. Really, thank you.
Thank you.
You want to say any more?
I think I've said everything. I'm kind of overwhelmed.
I am extraordinarily moved by what you've shared with us, looking back into this great mind, and also giving us some sense of who we are. I am moved by the story that you told, but I'm also equally moved by you. I mean, your inquisitiveness, your devotion to history and bringing it to life for us and sharing von Humboldt in this way. Don't you guys agree? Ah, amazing.
What am I supposed to say now? I think you all are amazing.
That's
I mean,
what I
I
think.
just so wish we could have him here now. And
I know.
instead
Do you
of
ever want to meet him?
Yes, if I could invite one person to a dinner party, it would definitely be him.
I understand entirely. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much. Bye.
Once again, thanks.